In the spring of 1943, the 7mm airdrome outside Port Moresby, New Guinea, was not a place where you went to win a war. It was a place where machines went to die. The tropical heat pressed down on the runway like a physical weight, baking the aluminum skins of the aircraft until they were too hot to touch. The air smelled of gas, rotting jungle growth, and the sour sweat of men who hadn't slept in a week. At the far end of the tarmac, away from the active flight line, sat the boneyard. This was the elephant graveyard of the 5th Air Force. It was a collection of broken B-7 bombers that had been torn apart by Japanese fighters and spat out by the sky. Some were missing wings, others had fuselages that looked like Swiss cheese. They were stripped for parts, scavenged by mechanics to keep the few surviving planes in the air. Sitting in the middle of the scrap heap was a plane that even the scavengers avoided. It was B-7 serial number 412666. The tail number ended in 666. To a superstitious airman, that was reason enough to walk away. But the curse of this plane went deeper than a number. It had a reputation. It had arrived in the Pacific with a heavy tail section that made it handle like a dump truck. It was sluggish. It was unresponsive. The pilots who had tried to fly it said it wallowed in the air. It didn't want to climb. It didn't want to fight. It had been parked in the boneyard and forgotten, left to rot in the rain while the war moved on without it. The ground crews called it a hangar queen. The experts said it was trash. They said the only thing it was good for was scrap metal. But Captain Jay Zeamer was not an expert. He was a problem. Zeamer was a pilot who didn't fit the mold of a standard Army Air Force officer. He was 34 years old, older than most of the boys flying the heavy iron. He had a reputation for being difficult. He didn't like flying in formation. He didn't like waiting for orders. He had a condition that made it impossible for him to sleep for long stretches. So he spent his nights wandering the flight line with a flashlight, inspecting engines, studying maps, searching for something to do. The brass called him an eager beaver, which in the military is not a compliment. It means you are a loose cannon. It means you take risks that aren't calculated. Zeamer had been drifting around the squadron without a crew and without a plane. Nobody wanted to fly with him because he was too aggressive. Nobody wanted to give him a plane because he would probably wreck it. So he spent his time in the boneyard. He looked at the neglected airframe. He didn't see a pile of junk. He saw a project. He saw a heavy, steady platform that nobody else wanted. Heck knew that in a war where planes were scarce, a pilot with his own bomber, even a broken one, was his own boss. He could volunteer for the missions nobody else wanted. He could fly on his own terms. He began spending his days working on the cursed plane. He cleaned the spark plugs. He patched the holes in the aluminum skin with pieces of metal from other wrecks. He tuned the engines until they stopped coughing and started roaring. He treated the abandoned machine like a classic car restoration. The other pilots laughed at him. They asked him why he was wasting his time on a lemon. They asked him if he planned to taxi it into combat because it certainly wasn't going to fly. Zeamer ignored them. He was building something. But a pilot is nothing without a crew. And no sane airman would volunteer to fly in a cursed plane with a pilot who couldn't sleep. So Zeamer recruited the insane ones. He went to the bar. He went to the brig. He looked for the men who were on the edge of being court-martialed or kicked out. He looked for the screw-ups. He found Joseph Sarnosky, a bombardier who was arguably the best shot in the Pacific, but had a reputation for insubordination. Sarnosky was a man who hated discipline but loved to fight. He became Zeamer's right hand. Together, they went through the roster like shoppers at a discount store. They found a navigator who had been rejected by other crews. They found gunners who had attitude problems. They assembled a band of misfits, renegades, and cast-offs. This was the Eager Beaver's crew. They were the bad news bears of the 5th Air Force. While Zeamer was building his Frankenstein plane, the war in the Pacific was hitting a wall. The American forces were trying to push north toward the Philippines. But there was a massive obstacle in their path, the island of Bougainville. This was a Japanese fortress. It was a jagged volcanic rock covered in jungle and ringed with airfields. The Japanese had turned it into a hornet's nest. They had hundreds of Zero fighters stationed there. They had anti-aircraft guns covering every approach. Intelligence knew that if the Americans tried to invade Bougainville without knowing exactly where the guns were, it would be a massacre. They needed a map. They needed detailed high-resolution photographs of the coastlines, the reefs, and the airfields. But getting those photos was considered impossible. To map the island, a plane would have to fly straight and level for 20 minutes. It would have to fly in daylight, and it would have to fly alone. A formation of bombers would be too slow and would attract too much attention. A single fighter plane didn't have the range or the cameras. It had to be a heavy bomber. The generals looked at the mission profile and saw a suicide note. Sending a single B-7 over Bougainville in broad daylight was like sending a slow cow to swim through a tank of piranhas. The Japanese Zeros would swarm it. They would tear it apart before the photographer could even open the shutter. The mission was circulated through the squadrons. Every experienced pilot refused it. They weren't cowards. They were just good at math. 1 bomber versus 100 Zeros equals 0 survivors. Command was stuck. They needed the photos, but they couldn't order a crew to commit suicide. They needed volunteers. Jay Zeamer heard about the mission. He was standing on the tarmac, wiping grease from his hands, looking at his resurrected bomber. He glanced at Sarnosky. They didn't do the math. They didn't think about the odds. They thought about the opportunity. This was the ticket. If they volunteered for the impossible run, the brass would have veto let them fly. They would have to let them take the Boneyard bomber into combat. Zeamer walked into the operations tent and put his name on the list. The operations officer looked at him like he was insane. He looked at the tail number off the plane Zeamer planned to fly. He tried to talk him out of it. He explained that the plane was a dog. He explained that the Japanese defenses on Bougainville were the heaviest in the Solomon Islands. He explained that nobody had ever flown a mapping run over that sector and returned alive. Zeamer simply smiled. He said his crew was ready. He said his plane was ready. He said he would get the pictures or he wouldn't return. The officer stamped the papers. He probably thought he was signing a death certificate, but Zeamer wasn't planning to fly over Bougainville in a standard B-7. He knew the experts were right about one thing. A standard bomber would be slaughtered. A standard B-7 had blind spots. It had weak points. The Japanese pilots knew those weak points. They knew that if they attacked from the front straight at the nose, the bomber had very little firepower to stop them. The standard nose gun was a small 30 caliber machine gun that couldn't hit hard enough or far enough to stop a charging Zero. It was a defensive weapon meant to scare planes away, not destroy them. Zeamer knew that if he was going to survive a solo run, he didn't need to scare them. He needed to kill them. He went back to the boneyard. He told his crew to grab wrenches and welding torches. They were about to do something that was strictly against regulations. They were going to modify the airframe. The manual said the B-7 carried 10 machine guns. Zeamer decided that wasn't enough. He wanted more. He wanted a flying battleship. They scavenged guns from wrecked aircraft. They found heavy 50 caliber machine guns, the kind that could punch through an engine block at half a mile. They began cutting holes in the fuselage of the resurrected wreck. They mounted guns in the waist windows. They mounted guns in the floor. They doubled the firepower, but the biggest change was in the nose. Zeamer wanted a gun he could fire himself. He wanted to turn the heavy bomber into a fighter. He found a fixed gun mount usually used on attack aircraft and bolted a 50 caliber machine gun directly to the floor of the cockpit, aiming forward through the nose glass. He rigged a trigger to the control yoke. This was insane. A B-7 pilot is supposed to fly the plane, not shoot. The engineers would have screamed if they saw it. They would have said the recoil would crack the glass. They would have said the weight would throw off the center of gravity. They would have said it was impossible to aim a 30-ton bomber like a rifle. Zeamer didn't care what the engineers thought. He sat in the cockpit and sighted the gun. He imagined a Japanese Zero coming at him head-on. He imagined the shock on the enemy pilot's face when the helpless bomber started spitting heavy lead from the nose. He knew that the only way to survive the swarm was to be the porcupine. He told Sarnosky to mount another 50 caliber in the nose on a flexible mount so the bombardier could sweep the sky. They packed the plane with ammunition. They loaded the cameras. They filled the fuel tanks to the brim. On the morning of the mission, the flying battleship sat on the runway, heavy and menacing. It looked different, bristling with 19 machine guns, nearly double the standard loadout. It sat low on its landing gear, groaning under the weight of the extra steel and lead. The other crews watched them prepare. There were no jokes this time. There was a quiet, somber respect. It was the kind-off look you give a man who is walking to the electric chair. They knew where Zeamer was headed. They knew he was flying a piece of junk into the heart of the enemy empire. They didn't expect to see him again. Zeamer fired up the engines. They caught with a smoky roar. The plane trembled, felt heavy, felt like a brick. But as he pushed the throttles forward, the old bomber began to roll. It gained speed, sluggish at first, then faster. The trees at the end of the runway rushed closer. For a moment it looked like they wouldn't clear them. The weight was too much. The curse was dragging them down, but then Zeamer pulled back on the yoke. The wheels left the ground. The heavy iron clawed its way into the humid air, shaking off the dust of the boneyard. They were airborne. They turned north toward the mountains, toward Bougainville, and toward a destiny the experts said was impossible. They were a ghost plane flown by a ghost crew heading into a fight that would rewrite the history books. The flight to Bougainville was not a journey. It was a physical argument between the laws of aerodynamics and the stubborn will of the crew. The flying warehouse was heavy. With 19 machine guns, thousands of rounds of ammunition, full fuel tanks, and the bulky mapping cameras, the bomber felt less like an aircraft and more like a flying warehouse. It wallowed through the air. Every time, Captain Jay Zeamer touched the controls, and the plane hesitated before answering, as if it were deciding whether it really wanted to turn. The engines droned with a deep throaty vibration that rattled the fillings in the crew's teeth. They were climbing slowly, clawing for altitude inch by inch, heading north over the Solomon Sea toward the most dangerous island in the Pacific. Inside the fuselage, the air grew colder with every 1,000 feet of altitude. At 20,000 feet, the tropical heat of New Guinea was a distant memory, replaced by a sub-zero chill that cut through the leather flight jackets and numbed the fingers. The crew moved through the plane, checking the modifications the experts said would never work. They were essentially test pilots for a machine that shouldn't exist. They were inspecting the porcupine they had built with stolen parts and welding torches. The waist gunners stood in the center of the plane, surrounded by a carpet of ammunition belts. In a standard B-7, the waist guns were the primary defense, but they were often cramped and hard to aim. On this plane, the crew had ripped out the standard mounts and built their own. They had raided wrecks for extra feed chutes and spare barrels. They had mounted twin guns where there had once been singles. They had cut extra holes in the floor and mounted heavy 50 caliber machine guns pointing downward, covering the belly-blind spot Japanese fighters loved to exploit. It looked like a junkyard inside, a chaotic maze of steel and brass. But it was chaos designed for killing. But the most radical piece-off engineering was in the nose. In a normal bomber, the nose is the office of the bombardier and the navigator. It is a glass bubble designed for reading maps and aiming bombs, not for fighting. The standard defensive gun was a small, flexible 30 caliber machine gun that looked like a toy compared to the heavy cannons on the Japanese fighters. It was like bringing a pistol to a rifle fight. Zeamer knew the Japanese pilots were smart. They knew the B-7's nose was weak. They were trained to attack head-on, flying straight at the cockpit glass, knowing the Americans couldn't shoot back with enough force to stop them. Zeamer had fixed that problem with a wrench and a refusal to follow the rules. He sat in the pilot's seat, gripping the control yoke. Bolted to the floor in front of him, extending through the nose cone, was a fixed 50 caliber machine gun. It wasn't on a swivel. It wasn't aimed by a gunner. It was aimed by the plane itself. Zeamer had rigged a trigger switch onto his flight controls. If he wanted to shoot a Japanese plane, he didn't call for a gunner. He simply turned the entire bomber until the enemy filled the window and squeezed the trigger. He had turned a 4-engine bomber into the world's biggest, slowest fighter plane. Beside him in the nose, Bombardier Joseph Sarnosky manned another heavy 50 caliber on a flexible mount. They had turned the glass bubble into a turret, As they approached the coastline of Bougainville, the mood in the plane shifted from tension to a cold, professional focus. The island appeared on the horizon, a green stain on the blue ocean. It looked peaceful from a distance, but the crew knew better. That green jungle was hiding an army. The airfields carved into the coast were hives of Zero fighters, the Mitsubishi A6M. The Zero was a predator. It was fast, agile, and climbed like a rocket. It was made of lightweight aluminum and had no armor, which made it fragile. Viewed in the hands of a skilled pilot, it was a samurai sword. It could slice a heavy American bomber to ribbons. Zeamer leveled the plane off at 25,000 feet. He checked his compass. He checked his airspeed. This was the moment of maximum danger. To get the photos, they had to fly in a straight line. They couldn't weave. They couldn't dodge. They had towed a steady platform for the cameras mounted in the belly. They had to fly straight and level over the enemy's home for 20 minutes. It was like walking a tightrope while someone threw rocks at you. Zeamer keyed the intercom. He told the crew to keep their eyes open. He told them to watch the sun. Japanese fighters loved to hide in the glare, diving out of the blinding light to ambush their prey. The cameras started clicking. The big lenses in the belly of the plane began snapping high-resolution images of the reefs, the beaches, and the jungle trails. Every click was a piece of intelligence that would save marine lives during the invasion. But every second that passed was another second the Japanese radar operators were tracking them. The silence in the headsets was heavy. It was the sound of men holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable. They were alone. There were no friendly fighters to shield them. There was no backup. If they got into trouble, the nearest help was 400 miles away. Then the voice of the tail gunner crackled over the intercom. He didn't shout. He didn't scream. He simply said the words that every bomber crew dreads. Contacts. 6 o'clock low. Climbing. Zeamer looked back. He couldn't see them yet, but he knew what was happening. The Japanese had scrambled. They weren't sending a patrol. They were sending a swarm. The tail gunners began counting. 1, 2, 5, 10. The numbers kept rising. 17, 20. Fighters were rising from the jungle airfields like a cloud of furious wasps. They were climbing fast, their engines screaming as they clawed for altitude to intercept the lone intruder. The experts would have said this was the moment to abort. A sane pilot would have shoved the throttles to the firewall, dropped the nose, and dove for the cloud cover. 1. Bomber against 17 fighters is not a battle. It is an execution. But Zeamer didn't turn. He didn't dive. He held the line. He needed the photos. He told Sarnosky to keep the cameras running. He told the gunners to check their feeds. He was going to complete the run. The Japanese pilots must have been puzzled. They saw a single B-7 cruising along in the clear sky. It wasn't fleeing. It wasn't maneuvering. It looked like a practice target. They probably laughed. They probably radioed each other, claiming the kill before they even fired a shot. They split into groups, setting up their attack patterns. They were methodical. They were going to carve the bomber apart. The lead flight of Zero swung around to the front. They were going to execute the classic 12 o'clock high attack. They climbed above the bomber, turned and dove straight at the nose. This was the textbook move. They knew the B-7 was weak in the front. They planned to scream in head-on, raking the cockpit with their 20mm cannon, killing the pilots and shattering the glass, then peeling away before the slow American turrets could track them. It was a move that had worked 100 times before. Zeamer watched the lead Zero turn. He saw the wings level out. He saw the sun glint off the canopy. The Japanese pilot was coming straight down the chute, locked into the collision course. Zeamer didn't flinch. He didn't bank away to avoid the fire. Instead, he did something the Japanese pilot never expected. He turned the bomber toward the fighter. He used the rudder pedals to skid the heavy plane, lining up the nose like a sniper Iminga rifle. The Japanese pilot was closing at 400 miles an hour. He was waiting until he was within cannon range. He was looking at the glass nose of the bomber, expecting to see a terrified pilot trying to hide. Instead, he saw the muzzle of a heavy machine gun pointed directly at his face. Zeamer waited. He waited until the Zero filled the windshield. He waited until he could see the propeller spinning. He squeezed the trigger on the yoke. The fixed .50 caliber machine gun in the nose roared. The recoil shook the entire cockpit floor. A stream of heavy lead slugs mixed with armor-piercing incendiary rounds burst from the nose of the bomber. This wasn't the light scattered fire of a defensive gun. This was precise heavy fire. The rounds slammed into the lead zero. They didn't just punch holes. They shattered the engine block. They ripped the wings apart. The Japanese fighter disintegrated in midair. 1 second, it was a lethal machine diving for the kill. The next second, it was a fireball of wreckage tumbling past Zeamer's window. The explosion stunned the Japanese formation. They had flown into a trap. This wasn't a helpless old bomber. It was a predator in disguise. Sarnosky, the bombardier, opened fire with his flexible nose gun, catching the second Zero as it tried to break away. His bullets tore through the enemy fuselage, sending smoke trailing into the sky, but the surprise only lasted a second. The remaining 15 Zeros were professionals. They realized the fight had changed and they reacted with fury. They abandoned the textbook attacks and swarmed the bomber from every angle. They came from the sides, from above, from below. The sky around the lone bomber turned into a storm of tracers. 20mm cannon shells slammed into the wings, punching holes the size of dinner plates. Bullets ripped through the aluminum skin, sounding like hail on a tin roof. The interior of the bomber became a slaughterhouse. The waist gunners were slipping on thousands of spent brass casings that covered the floor. The air was thick with the smell of burning cordite and hydraulic fluid. Sarnosky was fighting like a madman in the nose, swinging his gun from side to side, calling out targets. A cannon shell exploded against the nose glass, throwing Sarnosky backward. He was hit. Shrapnel tore into his stomach. He collapsed onto the floor, blood spreading across the metal deck. Zeamer glanced over. His friend was down. The nose was open to the wind, a jagged hole where the glass had been. The wind roared into the cockpit, a hurricane of freezing air and noise. Zeamer felt a sledgehammer blow to his leg. A bullet had punched through the fuselage and shattered his knee. Another struck his wrist. His flight suit was drenched with blood. The controls felt heavy, sluggish. The hydraulic system was hit. The oxygen system was leaking, but the plane was still flying. The engines were still running, and Sarnosky wasn't finished. The bombardier dragged himself up from the floor. He was mortally wounded. He was bleeding out, but he crawled back to his gun. He pulled himself upright, gripping the handles with white knuckles. He looked out through the shattered nose at the swarm of fighters circling for another pass. He didn't look like a dying man. He looked like Amon, who had decided that if he was going down, he wasn't going alone. He racked the charging handle on his machine gun and pointed it at the sky. Zeamer gritted his teeth against the agony in his legs. He shoved the throttles forward. He wasn't turning back. They still had photos to take. The Zeros regrouped, diving again, furious now, determined to finish off the crippled giant. They thought the bomber was finished. They thought the crew was done. They were about to learn that the Porcupine was only getting started. The battle wasn't over. It had just become a brawl. The fight over the coast of Bougainville had stopped being a tactical engagement and had turned into a street fight at 25,000 feet. The Japanese Zero pilots were enraged. They had hit the American bomber with everything they had. They had raked it with cannon fire, riddled it with machine gun bullets, and blown holes in the fuselage big enough to throw a dog through. By all the laws of aviation, the B-7 should have been falling in flames. It should have been a smoking crater in the jungle, but the battered giant was still flying. It was shaking, rattling, and leaking fluids, but the 4 Wright Cyclone engines were still churning, dragging the wounded airframe through the sky. And worse for the Japanese, the dead crew was shooting back. Captain Jay Zeamer was fighting a war on 2 fronts. One was against the enemy planes swarming outside his window. The other was against his own body. A Japanese bullet had smashed through the cockpit floor and shattered his left knee. Another had torn through his wrist. He was losing blood fast. His flight suit was heavy and wet. The pain was a blinding, white-hot pulse that threatened to make him pass out. but he couldn't pass out. If he let go of the yoke, the heavy bomber would roll over and spin into the sea. He had to fly the plane with one good hand and one good leg. He wedged his broken leg against the rudder pedal, using his dead weight to keep the plane trimmed. He ignored the blood pooling on the floor. He focused on the Zeros. The Japanese pilots had realized that attacking from the front was suicide. The fixed gun in the nose had taught them a lethal lesson, so they changed tactics. They split up, circling the bomber like a pack of wolves, looking for a weak flank. They attacked from the sides, the rear, and below. They tried to overwhelm the gunners with sheer numbers. They came in waves 3 or 4 at a time, their wings lighting up with muzzle flashes, but Zeamer's unauthorized modifications were waiting for them. When a flight of Zeros dove on the waist of the bomber, expecting to find the standard single guns, they were met by a wall of lead from Thetwin-mounted 50 calibers. The American gunners weren't firing defensive bursts. They were pouring fire into the enemy. The waist of the plane was chaos. The gunners were slipping on thousands of spent brass casings that rolled across the floor like marbles. They were shouting targets to each other, swinging the heavy guns on their custom mounts, tracking the fast-moving fighters. The air inside the fuselage was thick with smoke. In the nose, Bombardier Joseph Sarnowski was dying. The shrapnel wound in his stomach was fatal. He knew it. The rest of the crew knew it. He had collapsed earlier, but the sound of the guns had woken him up. He had dragged himself back to his station, pulling his body up to the flexible machine gun. A Japanese fighter, thinking the nose gunner was dead, made a slow, arrogant pass across the front of the bomber, banking to show its belly. It was a fatal mistake. Sarnowski opened fire. He didn't have the strength to aim perfectly, but he had the instinct. He walked the tracers into the Zero's fuel tank. The Japanese plane exploded, vanishing in a flash of orange fire. Sarnowski slumped back against the bulkhead, exhausted, but he kept his hand on the trigger. He refused to leave his post. The battle dragged in. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15. In an air war, a dogfight usually lasts seconds. This was a marathon. The Japanese were relentless. They shot out the hydraulic system, meaning the landing gear and brakes were dead. They shot out the oxygen system. This was critical. At 25,000 feet, the air is too thin to breathe. Without oxygen masks, a man passes out in minutes. Zeamer recognized the danger. He had to get down. He had to dive. But if he dove, he would lose the altitude advantage. He would bring the plane right into the teeth of the anti-aircraft guns on the ground. He made a decision. He pushed the nose down, but not into a steep dive. He entered a shallow, high-speed descent, trading altitude for airspeed. He was trying to outrun the swarm. The heavy bomber picked up speed, the airframe groaning under the strain. The wind roared through the shattered nose, freezing the blood on Sarnowski's uniform. Zeamer fought the controls. The loss of hydraulics meant he was flying on pure mechanical linkage. He had to muscle the 30-ton plane through the air. Every turn, every correction sent shocks of agony through his shattered leg. The Japanese followed them down. They sensed the kill. They saw the smoke trailing from the number 3 engine. They saw pieces of metal peeling off the tail. They pressed the attack. A Zero came in from the tail, sitting in the blind spot, pouring cannon fire into the rudder. The tail gunner, Sergeant Pudgy, was waiting. He had been quiet, conserving his ammo. Now he opened up. He didn't just fire, he surgically dismantled the attacker. He shot the prop off the Zero. The Japanese plane stalled and fell away. Another Zero tried to attack from below, aiming for the ball turret. But the ball turret gunner was already tracking him. The gunner spun the turret, following the fighter as it climbed. He waited until the Zero was close, then unleashed a long burst. The Japanese plane flew straight into the stream of bullets. The engine block shattered. The pilot bailed out, his parachute popping open white against the blue sky. The crew of the Flying Fortress was methodical. They weren't panicking. They were angry. They had been sent to die in a junk plane, and they were taking it personally. They were making the Japanese pay for every inch of sky. They had shot down 2 fighters, then 3, then 4. The Japanese squadron was losing planes faster than they could believe. They had never seen a bomber fight like this. It was like fighting a battleship that could fly. Zeamer checked his watch. They had been fighting for 40 minutes. 40 minutes of non-stop combat. The ammunition was running low. The gunners were yelling that their barrels were overheating. The plane was barely holding together. The instrument panel was shattered. The radio was dead. The rudder cables were frayed, hanging by a few thin strands of wire. And Zeamer was fading. The blood loss was making him lightheaded. His vision was tunneling. He could see the horizon, but the edges of the world were turning gray. He slapped his own face to stay conscious. He couldn't die yet. He had to get them home. The Japanese finally broke off. They were low on fuel. They were low on ammunition. And frankly, they were shaken. They had thrown 17 of their best fighters at a single broken American bomber, and the bomber had defeated them. They had lost 5 planes confirmed, with others damaged. They turned back toward Bougainville, leaving the smoking, battered hulk of the fortress alone in the sky. But the battle wasn't over. The fight against the enemy was finished, but the fight against the airplane was just beginning. Zeamer leveled off at 10,000 feet. He looked around the cockpit. It was a wreck. Glass was everywhere. Blood was everywhere. Sarnowski was unconscious in the nose, barely breathing. The other crew members were wounded. The navigator was trying to wrap Zeamer's leg with a first aid kit, but the wound was too deep. Zeamer waved him off. He pointed to the map. He needed a course for home. Port Moresby was 400 miles away. That's a long flight in a brand new aircraft. In a plane with shot-out engines, no hydraulics, and a pilot who was bleeding to death. It's an eternity. The flight back was a haze of pain and silence. Zeamer drifted in and out of consciousness. He would black out for a second. The plane would dip and the adrenaline would jerk him back awake. He hallucinated. He thought he saw zeros in the clouds. He thought he saw the runway, but it was only the ocean. The crew tried to assist him. The co-pilot offered to take the controls, but Zeamer refused. He knew the plane better than anyone. He knew its quirks. He knew that with the damage to the control cables, a heavy hand would snap the wires and kill them all. He had to fly it himself. He had to feel the airplane. He flew with his fingertips, sensing the vibrations, coaxing the dying machine to remain airborne. They crossed the coast of New Guinea. The mountains of the Owen Stanley Range rose up in front of them. Zeamer had to climb to clear the pass. He pushed the throttles forward. The engines protested. The temperature gauges redlined. The oil pressure dropped, but the old engines held on. They climbed over the jagged peaks, clearing the trees by feet. The airfield at Port Moresby appeared in the distance. It was the most beautiful sight Zeamer had ever seen. But now he had a new problem. No hydraulics meant no brakes and no flaps. He would have to land the heavy bomber at high speed. And once he touched down, he wouldn't be able to stop. And he had one good leg to work the rudder. He called the tower. No response. The radio was dead. He fired a red flare from the cockpit window to signal an emergency. The ground crews saw the battered plane approaching and cleared the runway. Fire trucks raced to the tarmac. Ambulances waited. Zeamer lined up the approach. The plane was coming in fast. He cut the power. The crippled bomber dropped toward the ground. Zeamer fought the crosswind. He had to keep the wings level. If a wingtip caught the runway at this speed, the plane would cartwheel and explode. He flared the nose. The main wheels hit the runway with a screech of rubber. The plane bounced, settled. It was rolling fast, devouring the tarmac. Zeamer stomped on the rudder pedal with his good leg, trying to keep it straight. He didn't have brakes, so let friction do the work. The plane rolled and rolled. It reached the end of the runway. It rolled into the dirt. It finally ground to a stop in a cloud of dust just feet from the jungle edge. The silence that followed was deafening. The engines sputtered and died. The props stopped spinning. Zeamer slumped over the yoke. He had done it. He had brought them back. He closed his eyes, letting the darkness finally claim him. He didn't hear the sirens. He didn't hear the mechanics shouting as they ran toward the aircraft. He didn't see the look of horror on their faces as they saw the condition of the plane. The bomber looked like it had been fed into a meat grinder. There were hundreds of bullet holes. The nose was gone. The tail was shredded. It was a miracle the pieces had stayed together long enough to land. The medics pulled Zeamer from the cockpit. He was unconscious, pale as a sheet. They pulled Sarnowski from the nose. He was still alive, but barely. He looked up at the pilot being loaded onto a stretcher. He whispered something, but no one heard it. The rest of the crew stumbled out of the waste door, kissing the ground. They looked back at their plane. It was leaking oil and fuel into the dirt. It looked like a corpse, but it was the corpse that had saved their lives. They had flown into the mouth of hell, spat in the devil's eye, and walked back out. The misfit crew had done the impossible, but the cost was high. The real fight for Jay Zeamer and Joe Sarnowski was just beginning in the hospital tent. The war was over for them, but the legend of the Boneyard bomber was only beginning. When the dust finally settled on the runway at Port Moresby, the silence around the shattered plane was heavier than the noise of the battle. The ground crews who ran out to the bomber stopped 10 feet away, staring in disbelief. They were used to seeing damaged planes. They were used to patching bullet holes and replacing engine cowlings. But this was different. The bomber looked like it had been used for target practice by the entire Japanese Navy. There wasn't a single square foot of aluminum that wasn't dented, torn, or perforated. The tail section was hanging by shreds off metal. The rudder was gone. The wings looked like lace. The nose, the glass office where Joe Sarnowski had fought his last battle, was completely shattered, open to the air, covered in blood and spent brass casings. The mechanics started counting the holes. They stopped when they reached 100. Then they stopped when they reached 150. The final count was staggering. There were 187 bullet holes and 5 large cannon shell holes in the fuselage. That was just the damage they could see. Inside the plane was devastation. The control cables were frayed down to their last strands. The hydraulic lines were severed. The oxygen tanks were punctured. By every rule of engineering, the plane should have torn apart in midair. The main wing spar, the solid steel beam that holds the wings to the fuselage, was cracked. If Zeamer had pulled the yoke just a little harder during the landing, the wings would have snapped off. The plane hadn't flown back on aerodynamics. It had flown back on stubbornness. The medics carefully pulled the crew from the wreckage. It was a grim procession. Captain Zeamer was unconscious. His flight suit soaked in blood from the waist down. His leg was destroyed. The doctors who triaged him on the tarmac didn't think he would survive the night. He had lost half his blood volume. He had been flying a 30-ton bomber for 2 hours while bleeding to death. Bombardier Joseph Sarnowski was carried out next. He was still alive, but barely. He had taken a 20mm cannon shell to the stomach. In any other circumstance, he would have collapsed instantly. But he had stayed at his gun, fighting off the Zeros, protecting his pilot until the guns fell silent. He died shortly after being removed from the plane. He had held on to life just long enough to complete the mission. While the surgeons struggled to save Zeamer's life in the hospital tent, the intelligence officers rushed the film canisters to the photo lab. This was the reason for the blood. This was why Sarnowski had died. If the photos were blurred or if the cameras had been destroyed, the mission was a failure. The technicians developed the film in the darkroom, their hands trembling. They hung the negatives to dry. They examined the images through magnifying glasses. The photos were perfect. Despite the evasive maneuvers, despite the vibration of the guns, despite the damage to the plane, Zeamer had held the bomber steady enough to capture crystal-clear images of the Bougainville coast. The photos revealed everything. They showed the hidden gun emplacements. They showed the depth of the reefs. They showed the location of the Japanese airfields. It was the impossible map the generals had demanded. Those photos became the blueprint for the invasion. When the U.S. Marines eventually stormed the beaches of Bougainville later that year, they knew exactly where to land. They knew where the bunkers were. Countless American lives were saved because a misfit crew refusetto turned back when the sky turned black with fighters. Jay Zeamer didn't wake up for days. He lay in a coma, his body fighting shock and infection. When he finally opened his eyes, he was weak, unable to move his legs. The doctors told him he might never walk again. They told him that Sarnowski was gone. It was a bitter truth to accept. Zeamer had built the crew. He had modified the plane and he had led them into the fire. He felt the weight off command, the crushing burden of the survivor. But then the reports began to circulate throughout the squadron. The story of the dogfight had spread. The other pilots were talking about the porcupine that had fought off 17 Zeros. They were talking about the nose gun. They were talking about the crew that refused to die. The Army Air Force couldn't ignore what had happened. The experts who had called the plane a piece of junk and the crew a band of screw-ups were silenced by the sheer magnitude of the victory. The record books had to be rewritten. The Eager Beavers became one of the most decorated crews in the Pacific Theater. Every man on the plane received a medal, but the highest honors were reserved for the pilot and the bombardier. Captain Jay Zeamer and Second Lieutenant Joseph Sarnowski were both awarded the Medal of Honor. It is the highest military decoration the United States can bestow. It is rare for two men on the same aircraft to receive it for the same mission. It speaks to the intensity of the battle. The citations spoke of conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life, but the words on paper could never capture the reality of that cockpit. They couldn't capture the sound of the wind screaming through the shattered nose or the strain of the controls fighting against a broken leg. They presented Zeamer with the medal in the hospital. He was still in a cast, thin and frail, a stark contrast to the heavy bomber he had wrestled through the sky. He accepted it not for himself, but for Sarnowski. As for the legendary machine, the plane itself, its war was over. The mechanics surveyed the damage and shook their heads. It was beyond repair. You couldn't patch it this time. The structural damage was too severe. It was towed back to the boneyard, back to the scrap heap where Zeamer had found it. But this time, it wasn't parked with the junk. It was parked with reverence. It sat there under the tropical sun, its aluminum skin-scarred and torn, no longer a cursed relic, but a symbol of defiance. Skin fading, its guns removed, a silent monument to the violence of 1943. Pilots would walk out to see it. They would run their hands across the jagged holes. They would stare at the fixed gun mount in the cockpit floor and shake their heads. It was a machine that had done the impossible simply because the men inside it refused to believe it couldn't be done. Jay Zeamer defied the doctors just as he had defied the Japanese. He learned to walk again. Took time. Took pain. And it took the same stubborn resolve that had kept him in the air. But he stood again. He survived the war. He returned to the United States, a quiet hero in a nation celebrating the end of the conflict. He didn't write memoirs. He didn't tour the country. He lived a modest life. He worked in aviation, staying close to the aircraft he loved. He eventually moved to Maine, settled down, and raised a family. If you met him in his later years, you wouldn't guess he was a legend. He was simply a gentle, soft-spoken old man who liked to sit on his porch. He didn't boast about the day he faced an entire enemy air force alone. He didn't boast about the Medal of Honor. He kept it tucked away in a drawer. But in quiet moments, he must have drifted back Tot Hat Runway in Port Moresby. He must have remembered the smell of grease and the sound of radial engines coughing to life. He must have remembered the faces of the misfits, the men no one else wanted, who turned out to be Thebius crew in the sky. Jay Zeamer passed away in 2007. He was 88 years old. He was the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from the Army Air Forces. With his passing, the final connection to that terrible, glorious day over Bougainville was severed. But stories have a way of outliving the people who live them. The history of that impossible plane is still told in flight schools and mess halls. It is examined by historians. It is spoken about by mechanics. We share this story today because it's easy to be hypnotized by specs and spreadsheets. On paper, serial number 666 should have been scrap metal. The manual said it was too slow, too damaged, and crewed by the wrong kind of men. But the numbers never accounted for a pilot who refused to quit and a bombardier who kept firing while he bled out in the nose. You can measure horsepower and wing loading. You can't measure grit, loyalty, or raw stubborn fury. Jay Zeamer and his renegades proved that a cursed plane is only cursed if you choose to believe it. They proved that a misfit is simply a hero who hasn't found his battle yet. They took a broken machine and a broken reputation and forged them into a weapon that shattered the Japanese defenses. They reminded us that in the end, it's not the plane that makes the ace, it's the ace that makes the plane. So the next time you feel like the odds are stacked against you, the next time the experts tell you your plan is foolish or your equipment ice junk, remember the porcupine, remember the 19 guns, remember the solo run, and remember that as long as you have enough fuel to fly and enough courage to squeeze the trigger, you are never out of the fight. If the story of the bomber that wouldn't die fired you up, hit that like button. It helps us uncover more forgotten legends from the archives. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next deep dive into the history they left out of the textbooks. And tell us in the comments about another example of a cursed weapon that became a legend. We read every single one. Thank you for watching. Thank you for honoring the cursed bomber. Stay safe and keep flying.